All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for this afternoon's Learning Lab. Okay, I think we have some more participants coming in. So maybe we'll give maybe like 30 seconds for those still planning to join us. Okay, so welcome everyone to our Learning Lab B of the Educate International Conference on um, with the theme Advancing Foundational Learning to Build Resilience and Stability. This year's conference is taking place both here in Brussels and then online. And we're focusing on something which is very critical, which is education for stability. And we'll be exploring how education, humanitarian, and development actors can collaborate more effectively, especially in context of instability and conflict. Across the conference, we've been reflecting on how inclusive access to learning, the protection of schools, teachers, and learners, as well as the continuity of education, can strengthen and enhance resilience and its contribution to peace building. My name is Oyindamola Johnson. I work with VVOB as a global project and proposal developer, and I'll be moderating today's session. Educate.be is the Belgian platform for education and training in development cooperation, and this conference is organized with the support of its member organizations, partners, as well as the Belgian government. Educate.be uses the opportunity to thank all its member organizations, partners, speakers, participants joining us today. So thank you very much for joining us. Before we start, just some few very practical information. I see there's no one wearing headsets, so I guess we are fine. No one needs any translations because today's session is going to be in English as well as the presenters. However, if there's anyone who requires translation, please, their headsets available. And please, this session is really going to be very collaborative. So we would require your participation in terms of contributions, questions. And for online participants, please feel free to put in your questions in the chat box. Your questions are not just um, necessary, they're very critical to the conversations that we'll be having today. So let's go into the reason why we are here this afternoon. This session focuses on one central and one key question, which is how can we advance foundational learning, especially in fragile and crisis affected context? And why does this matter for stability and resilience? In fragile context, children are most likely to experience disrupted schooling, displacement, insecurity, teacher shortages, and weakened learning environments. These realities make it much harder for children to build the basic literacy and numeracy, as well as socio-emotional foundations and skills that they need to further their learning and thrive in life. But today's session is not just about the barriers, it's also about possibilities. It's also about the evidence, the practice, and the systems that help children continue learning in adversity. So we'll be exploring this topic from a few perspectives. What the evidence tells us about what works, the field experience from fragile and crisis affected settings, as well as the policy and partnerships needed to make this kind of work thrive. The broader argument is that foundational learning is not only an education priority, it is also an investment in human capital, participation, social cohesion, economic resilience, and long term stability. So, our aim today is to move from problem analysis to practical exchange on what works, why it matters, and what it takes. So, to kick off today's session, I'll be introducing one of our speakers. Her name is Katie Wade. Katie is a policy officer for education and skills at the European Commission's Directorate General for International Partnerships. Katie brings an important policy and partnership perspective to today's conversation, especially in relation to how international cooperation can support education systems, foundational learning, and resilience in fragile and crisis affected settings. Let's give a round of applause to Katie as she takes us through her session. Thank you.
Thank you, Damola, and good afternoon, everybody. As Damola said, my name is Katie Wade, and I am Education and Skills Policy Officer at the European Commission's Directorate General for International Partnerships. I'm working mainly on foundational learning and teacher training, and today I'm going to give an EU perspective on advancing foundational learning to build stability and resilience, and using the concrete example of the Regional Teachers Initiative for Africa. I'll touch upon why foundational learning is so important, including in crisis and conflict settings. I'll speak a little bit about the EU and the Global Gateway approach and why we are investing in teachers as part of that, and then how this comes together under the Regional Teachers Initiative for Africa, including for teachers in crisis contexts. And let's hope this works. Yes, it does. Mainly useful to start with a short definition of foundational learning. So these are the basic skills that children acquire during those very early years of schooling. So learning to read and write, learning to work with numbers, solve basic maths problems, but also basic social and emotional skills. And everything else is built on this. So these skills are the foundation for all future learning and skills. And without the basics, it can be hard to progress in school, hard to access training, get decent work, fully participate in the labour market, but also in society as a whole. And in crisis and conflict settings, foundational learning becomes even more crucial because schools provide a safe space, a daily routine, a sense of normality amid disruption, and they also play a protective role. And I think a lot of the panel members this morning touched upon this, but children who are in school are much less at risk of child labour, early marriage, recruitment by armed groups, and other forms of exploitation. As the EU, then, we are supporting partner countries in this effort. So around 12% of our current international partnerships budget goes towards education. And in the current multi-annual financial framework, which is our current budget running from 2021 to 2027, this is estimated at over 6 billion euros. Our view is that quality education isn't just a fundamental right, but it's also one of the most effective tools against poverty and inequality because it provides that pathway to jobs. The focus of our cooperation is on learning outcomes and also on equity and inclusion, so including for refugees, internally displaced children, and children with disabilities. We also know that needs are greatest where systems are weakest. So around 44% of INPA's education funding goes to fragile and crisis-affected contexts, where children face the highest risks of poverty, displacement, and exploitation. Supporting foundational learning in these contexts is a key part of our portfolio through an integrated approach, so not only reacting to crises, but also aiming to address those root causes and foster peace and stability. As a global actor in fragile context, the EU is engaged in some of the world's most fragile settings. So we use a broad toolbox in these places, such as political dialogue, diplomacy, humanitarian aid, and development cooperation. As part of that toolbox, we have our Global Gateway approach, which is our approach to international partnerships based on sustainable development. And the aim is to match partner countries' needs with EU strategic interests. The Global Gateway works in a 360-degree approach, so looking at democratic values, good governance, green transitions, private sector investment and security, for example, to really create an enabling environment for EU investments and business opportunities. And within the Global Gateway, education is one of the 5 core pillars. Our education support under the Global Gateway is currently working in around 80 partner countries. And we cover the whole spectrum of education, so from foundational learning and basic education to vocational education and training, and also higher education and research. When we work in fragile and crisis-affected contexts, these investments are context and conflict sensitive, following a do no harm principle. So we link long-term infrastructure and economic development with prevention, peace building, and resilience. However, we also understand that this classic investment logic isn't always possible. And in these contexts, the EU stays engaged through more flexible instruments and partnerships. So we focus on basic services and human capital, including community resilience, and access to basic education becomes a key entry point for engagement. Why then, as part of this, is the EU investing in teachers in Africa? Well, we know that the scale of the learning crisis is clear. And I think some of these facts were mentioned already in this morning's sessions, but there are currently 250 million children out of school worldwide. And 70% of 10-year-olds in low and middle income countries can't read a simple text. These disparities worsen by wealth, by race, by location, by gender, and the most vulnerable really are the hardest hit. We also know that there's a very large teacher gap. So by 2030, 15 million new qualified teachers will be needed across sub-Saharan Africa to reach universal primary and secondary education. Alongside that, many current teachers do not yet meet minimum qualification standards. Teachers are also working in very difficult conditions, so often with low or no pay, limited support, few professional growth opportunities. And so it's not only hard to ensure quality teaching, but it can also be hard to attract and retain teachers in remote, poor or fragile areas. Our rationale is that teachers are very much at the heart of better foundational learning and improving learning outcomes. And in order to do that, we must invest in better teacher policies, better initial and in-service training, and also better working conditions and support systems for teachers. I'd like to introduce then the Regional Teachers Initiative for Africa. So this is a €100 million EU-funded Global Gateway flagship programme running from 2023 to 2030 that really puts teachers and the teaching profession at the centre of EU education investment and the EU-Africa partnership. It's a joint EU-AU initiative, and it's a multi-level partnership that operates at continental, sub-regional and national levels. And it involves the European Commission and EU member states through a Team Europe approach, Belgium, Estonia, Finland and France, the African Union and African countries, and also UNESCO. And it works across very different contexts, so from relatively stable systems to highly fragile and crisis-affected settings also. And within those highly fragile and crisis-affected settings, we ensure that approaches are relevant. So by integrating conflict-sensitive and crisis-responsive and climate-resilient approaches into teacher policy and practice. The overall goal is to develop an inclusive, motivated and competent teacher workforce at pre-primary, primary and lower secondary levels, so that all schools have enough skilled, motivated and inclusive teachers for high-quality education for all. And the project is split across 5 windows. So the first one looking at deploying on-demand technical assistance to ministries of education in sub-Saharan Africa, looking at the development and implementation of policies, education and professional development for teachers. A second on testing and scaling up successful programs on teacher education and training on selected priorities, including in crisis contexts, and we'll speak a little bit more about that window on the next slide. Building research partnerships, so both regional research partnerships and AU-EU partnerships to better understand and strengthen teacher policies, teacher satisfaction and well-being, and produce evidence and better evidence for better teacher governance and professional development. A fourth window on strengthening regional capacity, coordination and frameworks, and then finally reinforcing regional knowledge sharing, advocacy, coordination and capacity building. As I mentioned then, within RTIA, we have a dedicated crisis window that reflects the EU's long-standing commitment to education in emergencies. Within this window, there's currently 6 projects that are working across 6 crisis-affected environments, so Burkina Faso, South Sudan, Uganda, Ethiopia, Mozambique, and Nigeria. And whilst they are 6 different projects being led by 6 different implementing partners, There are some common threads across all of them. So firstly, on retention and deployment in hard-to-serve areas, so helping teachers to stay or even move to areas where learners are most affected by crisis. Secondly, on continuous professional development for crisis settings, so crisis-responsive, conflict-sensitive and inclusive pedagogy, helping teachers to manage large and diverse class sizes, and also supporting children who have experienced trauma. And then finally, looking at providing psychosocial support and well-being for teachers. So we recognise that it's not just learners that face insecurity, displacement and disasters, but also teachers. And that teacher resilience is absolutely essential for sustaining learning. As an example of one of these projects, in Mozambique, local CSO ADPP is delivering a project through the window on teaching in climate change affected areas to enhance resilience and well-being. It's currently reaching around 900 in-service teachers in 60 primary schools, and the approach very much involves teachers in preparing schools for disasters, supporting children emotionally, and also restoring learning quickly after schools. And I think, Damola, we might show a video, if it's possible, on that.
Sure.
And then I'll come back to the last bit.
Eu respondo pelo nome de Emília Virgílio Francisco Fernando, professora dessa escola primária de Coroa e leciono a primeira classe. Eu gosto do meu trabalho e amo. O que gosto mais é que quando chego, todos os santos dias, meus alunos me elogiam, correm e me abraçam. Eu me sinto muito orgulhosa. Foi um fenômeno muito complicado. Na altura ficamos quase mesmo arruinados. Estávamos sem iluminação, a comida havia subido e para conseguir comer não era fácil. E na minha casa o teto saía, quase caiu e toda a roupa bem molhada, documentos molhados. As crianças também não conseguiam vir à escola e foi um momento que nós sofremos muito porque a nossa escola estava sem teto. E na altura as crianças mesmo estavam traumatizadas, porque foi uma coisa até que nem eu também nunca tinha visto desde a minha nascença. E depois, como aconselhar os meninos para poderem esquecer naquilo? Mas como papel de mãe usei meu esforço, não é? Informando que foi um fenômeno e já tinha passado, que as crianças deviam esquecer, não deviam colocar aquilo dentro de si. Uma coisa muito complicada, que ninguém gostaria que voltasse das próximas vezes. Praticamente cair e continuar de novo. Como professora, tenho toda a obrigação, não é, de poder aconselhar nas pessoas. Quando vejo que a temperatura ou o tempo não está bom, tenho a obrigação de aconselhar que devemos evitar sempre ficar por baixo das árvores e também devemos evitar andar nas ruas num momento de vendaval ou chuvas fortes e devemos estar num lugar seguro, não é, para preservarmos as nossas vidas. Então, sempre que vermos que o tempo não está bom, a previsão de mau tempo, sempre devemos evitar deslocarmos de qualquer maneira, senão podemos sofrer alguns danos. E a minha filha, Emília Sérgio Figueiredo, ela foi formada nesta área como membro do Comitê de Risco e Desastre. E eu posso dizer que vou me sentir orgulhosa porque ela vai conseguir usar dos conhecimentos na comunidade.
Thank you. So that was just one of the many initiatives that we are running under the Regional Teachers Initiative for Africa, providing practical advice and support to teachers, to students, but also to wider communities through things such as disaster response committees. think I'm probably almost at the end of my slot. So to sum up, for the EU, protecting foundational learning is not just a nice to have, it is an absolute must. If we support teachers on the front line, we're also protecting children's foundational learning, and in turn that keeps children connected to school and learning the basics even in very challenging circumstances. And this helps to maintain hope, maintain social cohesion, as well as contributing to resilience and stability in communities. Thank you very much, and I think I'm passing back to you, Damola.
Thank you very much, Katie. No, I think we can do better than that. Let's give a big round of applause. I'm sure you agree. I'm sure that that was very the video itself was very moving, and Katie has helped us in providing a strong and final perspective on how policy, financing, and partnerships are needed to move this agenda forward. So taking this a notch higher, I'll be inviting my next speaker. 1 minute, please. My next speaker is Heather Lake-Caton. Heather is a senior education specialist at the What Works Hub for Global Education, based at the University of Oxford. Her bio is available on the website for those who want to know more about her. But Heather brings a very important evidence perspective to today's conversation, helping us to reflect on what we know about improving learning outcomes and what it takes to translate evidence into practice in complex education systems. A big round of applause for Heather, please.
Which is rare, but it's working in this context. So thank you very much, and thank you to VVOB for inviting the What Works Hub here today. We're very grateful to be able to share some of our recent findings. So just a bit of context before we even start on the What Works Hub for Global Education. For those of you that aren't familiar, we're a big partnership organization based at the University of Oxford. We have many partners. I couldn't possibly list them all. And we're working in a number of countries across sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, doing research on the ground as well as synthesis research about what's working across different programs. We're specifically focused on research in foundational learning and really looking at, on one side, what works, what we already know about what works and how it works, not just what, but that was a very long name. And also what breaks down in implementation, because actually about learning and education we already know a lot, but it's not necessarily happening in classrooms and in practice on the ground. And so when things are being implemented, where are those gaps? What is happening in the implementation of programs that are leading to gaps? So what I'm presenting on today is one of our very recent synthesis work streams that we've done, which is looking specifically at what works to support foundational learning during disruptions. So when there's been school closures, when there's been any kind of disruption, what has worked to either ensure the continuity of learning, to maintain learning, but also sometimes to recover learning when schools reopen. There's sometimes accelerator programs or programs that are intervened to do that. In the context of this, thank you very much to Katie for just really emphasizing the importance of foundational learning and also defining it as to what we're talking about. There really is already a complex issue with foundational learning across a lot of the developing world, particularly with children not being able to learn to read, and then in the future not being able to move on. We see that on average across a study, half of young adults, so that was across 10 different countries, half of young adults who completed primary school could only read a few sentences in adulthood. And those kind of gaps, they persist for very long, and they create huge gaps, not just in learning, but economically in every sector, really. And another thing we see is that disruptions really compound this crisis. In South Africa, from half a year's worth of school closures in COVID-19, there was about 50 to 70% worth of a year's learning lost for the children that were out of school, even though there were programs to try and continue learning during that time. In Pakistan, following an earthquake, the learning losses following that earthquake for affected children persisted years after schools had reopened. It wasn't just a catch up and solved sort of situation. And the other thing we see is that these disruptions really fall hardest on the most vulnerable. For climate, extreme weather events in low-income countries between 2022 and 2024, 45 days of instructional time was lost. The equivalent in high-income countries was just 6 days. So these are really compounding onto already vulnerable children. And again, we also know that only 1 in 3 children living in conflict or fragile countries were out of school, or not only 1 in 3 were out of school in 2024. These issues really compound, so we've got an existing crisis, extra disruptions affecting more vulnerable children, and it just adds up to really impacting those vulnerable situations even more. So what we did for this synthesis was to look not just at one kind of case of disruption, but we looked across both acute and chronic disruptions. So disruptions that are sudden, that hit hard and hit quickly, as well as those that are ongoing and they really have prolonged effects. We looked at the evidence across those. We looked at climate-related events, we looked at epidemic contexts and events, including Ebola and COVID-19, and we looked at conflict as well. And across all of these, we saw there's really like different types in each. So for climate, for example, we see floods, we see cyclones, but there's also rising temperatures and heat stress that we know affect learning that are also ongoing. For conflict, there's often sudden insecurity, rapid forced displacement, but then there's the ongoing insecurity that builds from this and inaccessible schooling for long periods of time and instability and all of the things we've been speaking about today. And across all of these, we had really different ranges of evidence. So for example, for climate-related events, there's just very limited evidence in general. There's not a lot of people doing research into, we know how much they're occurring, but we don't know about how it's affecting learning. For COVID-19 in particular, there was really strong evidence. A lot of researchers jumped into action and really started trying to do interventions, try and do remote learning options, measure how well that was working. And for ongoing insecurity and displacement in conflict, we also had some moderate evidence in that field. But across the rest, it was very limited. So a lot of what I'll be presenting today is specifically from these two contexts, COVID-19 and Ebola in particular, and then also some ongoing examples of interventions that have happened within conflict situations. And we saw a number of different types of interventions. The evidence I'll be presenting on, or the examples I'll be showing you today, were mostly from RCT, or like randomized controlled trial experiments or quasi-experimental studies. And there's a few qualitative examples built in as well. So we had SMS-based support, so long text message services. WhatsApp groups were made for low-performing students to support students while they were out of school. There was also materials distribution, so either printed materials being distributed to households or laptops and devices being distributed as well. There were radio broadcasts. Many countries did radio broadcasts on different learning curriculum studies and things like that. Phone-based support, so a lot of phone tutorials or video call tutorials that were happening in different contexts. And then in-person support. So the in-person support falls into both during closures, so when schools were closed, distributing community leaders or teachers around to different areas, having learning groups and community centers that were having tutorials as well, but also after school catch-up clubs once schools reopened. So following an issue, schools reopened and then there were after school remedial clubs, specifically often for low-performing students. And what we see in this is there were some things that worked in some of the same things. So for SMS, one of the interventions that happened across 5 different countries did work, but others didn't. And the same was true across everything. What we saw in in-person support, generally, those did work. So we saw really different mixed results. And what we did next was to really look into what brings these together. what was similar, what were the features of what worked across these different interventions. And what we saw was when instruction was targeted to children's learning levels, when there was some kind of mechanism for understanding where children were in their learning journey, and there was regular two-way interaction between tutors and students, or teachers and students, or volunteers and students, different interventions took different forms, then things were effective. So these programs included some kind of direct responsive contact between teachers and students and each child. Across the RCT that involved 5 different countries, there were phone tutorials that assessed each child's learning level and then worked through content at that level. There were WhatsApp groups in a study in Pakistan where the lowest performing students were put into WhatsApp groups together, matched at their level, and then there was content that teachers would send through video, through WhatsApp, or just worksheets and things for them to work through. And then the students completed those activities on the mobile phone on WhatsApp, sent it back to the teachers, and got direct feedback from the teachers based on that. And there were also interactive radio interventions. These were done a while ago, so this was in conflict situations in Sudan and Somalia when USAID was still intervening there, where there was a facilitator present to really adjust the pace of the radio broadcasts and saying that this was in situations where maybe there weren't qualified teachers involved or able to get to these areas, and they could use this interactive radio for the content, but there was also a facilitator there to pause the content, to go back. The content was very interactive with lots of opportunities for students to engage and talk and be part of it. And these are just 3 examples of all of the programs and what they held and what they did to make sure that there was learning happening. If we look at what didn't work, we see that when there was grade level content delivered, even if it was paired with teacher contact, so even if teachers were in contact with the students, it didn't maintain learning when that contact was not able to be responsive to children's learning levels. So this is a really intuitive appeal of these approaches. They're scalable, like low cost, aligned with curriculum material. Let's deliver it over the radio or over television or distribute books to houses. But for some examples, in Sierra Leone, there were radio broadcasts nationally, and then there was a selection of students who got phone calls from their teachers to cover the content on the previous week's lessons that were broadcast. But what those teachers were finding was the students either hadn't listened to the previous week's content or were not at the level to engage in the previous week's content. But they didn't have the flexibility to adapt what they were doing in these phone tutorials. It was 15 minutes per child, it was quick, and there were no learning gains that we saw there. Similarly, in Kenya, there was a study where students got broadcast lessons and an online learning platform that they could access and go in and see the different materials. And then some of those students had teachers calling them to cover the content for the week. Or I think it was volunteers calling them actually in this particular one. But these produced no learning gains and actually on follow-up negative effects. And the researchers surmised that it was possible that the students getting the calls felt like their work was done. They had a call, that was their lesson done for the week or the day, and they didn't engage in the material further than that. And another one was also the RCT across 5 countries, which I'll go into more depth in. There was maths content, multi-level maths content, delivered by SMS, and there were mixed results with it. When it was paired with teacher phone calls to target, that worked, but when it wasn't, when it was just the content, there wasn't really positive effects seen from that. So if we look specifically at that study, it was a cross-country study. There was a proof of concept first in Botswana that was successful, and then the same intervention was implemented in Kenya, Nepal, Philippines, Uganda, and in India. But in India, they didn't do the SMS only. So what happened was students got multi-level mathematics content, still foundational learning, but like very basic addition, very basic subtraction, multiplication, division, increasing in complexity as it went through. And when the SMSs, just the SMSs were delivered, there was very limited or negative gains. The higher bars in Uganda were much longer school closures, almost 2 years in some cases. So that was where there were some results seen in the longer term. But when these specific SMSs were paired with phone tutorials where the teachers first assessed the learning level, figured out where the students were in their learning, and then just practiced one of those maths problems at that level for the 20-minute tutorial. Then we see really consistent gains across all of the countries. Again, the longer bars were the longer school closures, but really impactful gains in those countries. And so across all of these syntheses, basically focusing on what didn't work and what did work, we see that when instruction was targeted to the child's actual level, and when there was this regular two-way interaction between tutor and student, that's when interventions that were conducted became effective. That was the kind of missing link in some of them. And I know there's a lot on this slide, but really what I'm trying to show here is it's also not just one or the other. When there's no targeted instruction and there's no two-way interaction, there were no learning gains. When there was two-way interaction, so there were many studies where there were phone call tutorials, but there was no targeting, there was no flexibility to adapt what was happening, there were no learning gains. But when there was both, there were consistent learning gains across a number of different programs in a number of different contexts. And in the top right, you'll see it says not feasible to implement. It's very difficult to tailor content to a child's level if there's no interaction. So without that two-way interaction, you can't really figure out where children are. There were some interventions that did first only identified the low-performing students and only intervened for the low-performing students. And they were successful, but it's not feasible for that to continue as the students then progress. And we don't know at what rate they're progressing. And then these are just two cases in particular that I wanted to call out for children in really long-term chronic crisis-affected settings. So one was in Myanmar, where alongside catch-up clubs, so alongside programs that did foundational interventions that were targeted, there was also socio-emotional competency training included in that, where they did mindfulness practices, where they did a whole array of different interventions with these children. And what they saw at the end of the program was children with higher socio-emotional competency also did better on reading. And again, this is something we do already know, but it's something that now when we're looking into crisis contexts, we know matters too. And it's something that can really accelerate and improve things. In Niger, similar kind of program where there were tutoring sessions that were infused with mindfulness exercises and different games to help children regulate their responses to the chronic stress from displacement that they had been enduring. There wasn't direct scores on the specific tests that the researchers were doing, but there were improvements in their school grades. There were longer term improvements reported by teacher in their behavior, in their engagement with lessons, and just in terms of their broader impact, broader participation in the school and the classroom. This is one final thing that I wanted to call out as well, because I know when we're talking about these difficult marginalized communities or disconnected populations that are remote, often the interventions are mobile, SMS, video, things that are probably not necessarily accessible to everyone and definitely not the most marginalized. And so, for example, for the WhatsApp intervention that I described in Pakistan, only 29% of the households that were participating in that intervention allowed girls to access the devices in the home, even though schools were closed. And this is something we see across contexts, that girls, younger children, children with disabilities, they often face the greatest restriction on, even when there are devices, even when it is low bandwidth data being used, they still face restrictions on access. There were also connectivity constraints obviously with mobile data and bandwidth and things like that. Often the most disconnected communities are the ones that are left out of these. And economic pressures. So when children were forced to attend, there were seasonal labor demands for harvest or different other reasons for insecurity, then those children were not able to attend tutoring even when it was in their community, even when it was based in their community centers. And what we saw across these different interventions is those programs that leveraged existing infrastructure were able to remove these barriers. So when there were already in-person structures in place to have people that were placed in communities that had established relationships, and when there were cash transfers to support children getting places, they were able to leverage these structures during times of crisis. But those systems had to already exist before the crisis happened in order for them to work, in order for them to be successful. Those relationships are difficult to establish when things are disconnected or closed. And then finally, what we found throughout is similar to what I've been saying. The strategies for improving foundational learning, they're not crisis specific. Across all the different kinds of disruptions that we looked at, those that maintained and recovered learning would share the same features as other evidence-based strategies for improving learning. We know what works to improve learning. We know what really works when we intervene. We've known this for decades, not just through some recent research. We know that if you meet a child at the level that they're at and you slowly scaffold and build learning onto that, that is how they're going to access the content more readily. And if you are able to establish practices that do that during a crisis, it works exactly the same as it does in an ordinary classroom. And these things are not separate. It's one condition, it's one principle that carries across. And then the effective responses were built before the crisis arrived. Like I explained, when there was already trained staff, tested materials to distribute, and community relationships, it was much easier to continue or to even restart or implement or change. One of the programs in Aspire India was already doing practices in different communities. They had a full structure and network of community support that was doing, I think, well-being and health support. But when schools closed for COVID, they switched that to do foundational learning support. And they had the structure in place that was still able to reach over 100,000 students during the school closures, and now focus on educational content rather than the only content that they were focusing on before. And the gap that we have is really in implementation, not knowledge. It's fewer than half of low and middle income countries have these evidence-based practices in place, and when disruptions occur, the children who lose are already the furthest behind. And I really just want to promote investing in the conditions that support foundational learning for all children, because that's how we build education resilience. That's how we build resilience to be able to cope in stable situations. And it really supports the investment that already exists to continue to have resilience within the system. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heather, for that session. I think this conversation has helped to um, establish the evidence and remind us on why foundational learning needs to be approached with both rigor and urgency. Just a quick one. I'm sure that some of us are already having questions brewing. Just very shortly, we'll move on to questions. But you can just start writing them down now so that you don't forget any parts. And for our online participants, if you have any questions, please um, keep it coming and place it in the chat box. We already have someone helping us to keep record of them. So at the beginning of the session, I mentioned that we had 4 speakers, so 2 in person. So we're moving online now to our online speakers, and I'll be introducing them shortly. So for the next part of this session, we have 2 speakers. We are joined by 2 individuals, Hiwotie Simachu and Joseph Opondo, and they'll be sharing together. Hiwotie is the Deputy Country Director at Plan International Ethiopia. His bio is available on the website. And then Joseph Opondo is the Regional Education in Emergency Specialist, also at Plan International, but this time in Denmark. And then they'll both be taking us on this next phase of our session today. So together, they will bring both a field and regional perspective on what it means to support foundational education and foundational learning in context affected by crisis, instability, or urgency. So their contribution today would help us make the connection between evidence and research that we've heard of so far, especially as it relates to implementation, on the ground implementation. Let's move on to our online presenters. We'll be taking Hiwotie first, and then after Hiwotie, Joseph will be coming on to take his presentation. So if we can move to Hiwotie. Thank you very much.
Yeah, right. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Yehudi speaking. As a moderator is also introducing myself. I'm here sitting in Addis, like in terms of really just sharing the inclusive education and emergency programs that Plan International Ethiopia is leading in Ethiopia. It might be really just looking from the perspective of sharing some of the practical experience that we have. As most of you know, Ethiopia is experienced with overlapping and multiple crises at a time, starting from this conflict displacement towards the climate shocks. But Ethiopia is also just one of the big recipients of refugees from the neighboring region. So we have a very mix of dynamics in the education setups where we are also just responding for the different crises. You might also just surprise in terms of also just hearing that the number of children, school-age children out of school because of the different crises that we are in the country, which is exceeding 9 million, which might be also just bigger the total population of one of the European countries. But the number is also just controversial, being that humanitarian crisis also just looking from the political lens. And according to the agreed figure with the Minister of Education, it is related to 7.2 million school-age children are out of school because of the different crises that we have in the country. Like in terms of really just giving a sort of background on the education setup. So as Plan International, as being as a main education actor in a country, we try to really just provide an inclusive education service for children living in a crisis. So we have a different approach and methodology in terms of really just ensuring the inclusiveness of our education program, specifically focusing on the foundational learning. One of the approaches basically for following this formal learning, which is not really just quite related to the topic that we are also just going to discuss today. But other approach that we are also just followed is also just a foundation for the formal learning. So in terms of looking the different approach, one is related to the informal learning, where we are also just having this bridging education program that we have, which is also just stretched from 3 to 6 months. The implementation is also just depending on the different operational setups that we are in, and I will refreshing later on when we are also just looking the different operation setup that we have. But the catch-up classes is basically focusing on the foundational literacy and numeracy, particularly looking from the perspective of supporting those children to have the basic learnings at their level, not looking from the perspective of their linking with the age or the grade level, but in terms of really just looking to see how we are going to provide the basic literacy and numeracy at their level. The other, which is quite related to the non-formal learning, and those non-formal learning have its own also just a transition pathway, which is also just starting from this accelerated school readiness, particularly focusing on the early age, attached with the pre-primary and the accelerated education program, which is also just focusing on the older children that we have in the different setups. And recently, we also just initiated the so-called is a home-based instruction. So this is a different approach that we also just embedded in the education programs that we are doing in Ethiopia. In terms of looking the overall blueprints that we achieved in the different approach, as Plan International, we have been supporting 1.2 million school-age children for the last 3 years in a different approach, of which 65,000 students are from refuge, predominantly the South Sudan refuge living in the western part of the country. But of course, the Sudanese refuge living in Ethiopia is also just one of the project participants. But it's not only just working on the school environment and on the learner, but we also just working with the educators, specifically in terms of looking the capacity building of teacher, starting from providing the MHPSA support, but also just this continuous professional development. That is also just one of the big intervention that we have. In relation to the different modality, as Kribi just highlighted, the good practice that we have in Gambela, being that Ethiopia have a different region and different region have a different setup. So zoom in the Gambela education program that we are managing, we also just providing this accelerated education program, specifically targeting those older children who didn't get any education access before while they're living in South Sudan. That is basically tailored to the older children in terms of really just providing a very condensed curriculum and transition to the next grades based on the level of competency. The second approach is this bridging education program that we are implementing currently with the support of ECO. This bridging education program is targeting the new refugees crossing to Ethiopian border, and when we are also just looking the time of arrival of those refugees and the academic year, it is mismatching. So we designed this bridging education program for the newly arrival of refugees. That is meant to provide a very condensed and selected content education program for 3 to 6 months, and all the students are expected to move or transit to the formal education in the next academic year. But the bridging education program is basically focusing on some subjects and content, and all the formal education curriculum is condensed in terms of really just bridging the education gap that we have. In Benishangul Gumuz, where we have this the South Sudanese, the Sudanese refugees, so we have just a wide range of project participants from the perspective of looking the students' background. So we have just a mix of alternative education service for the children. One is looking from the catch-up classes, where we are also just focusing to provide basic and foundational teaching, specifically focusing on increasing the ability of learner on literacy and in numeracy. The bridging education is basically targeting for the newly arrivals in terms of really just looking to provide the condensed curriculum. And there are also just this the accelerated school readiness program for the old age children. So we have just that mix of education opportunities that's linked with the foundational learning. The other, which is quite important, which is also just new for the Ministry of Education, one of the existing challenge that we have in Amhara, which is on the northern part of the country, because of the conflict between the federal government and unknown armed groups. Education has been interrupted for the last 3 years, specifically in areas where controlled by the UAGs. They are not allowing us, like in terms of starting the education program. So we conducted a comprehensive assessment in terms of really just looking what kind of education activities that we are going to provide. One, from the perspective of safeguarding the school, being that the school is also just targeted with the existing conflict that we have. But most importantly, schools are also just used for the military base, either from the two sides. I think it's better to keep like that. So we work on this advocacy, particularly looking from the perspective of safe school declaration, but we converted from that approach as a solidarity mission in terms of really just advocating to the government and to the UAGs to really just keep school safe or protecting from any damage. So it have just a components of in terms of really just safeguarding the school. It also just an element of protecting the learner and the educator. Being that school is targeted in the middle of the conflict, families are fearing to send their school to children to the school. So we develop an alternative basic education activities, call it is home-based education, meaning that rather than bringing children to the school, we also just taking the school to the children, specifically looking to use the community learning hub, establishing a temporary learning space in the middle of the community where communities are feeling safe from the targeted attack of the students. So that is basically focusing on the socialization, providing the psychosocial support for the children and protecting children from any form of protection concern. It might be related to the child marriage. It might be just related to other protection concern. So it's not really just replacing the formal education, but like in terms of really just creating a learning environment in the middle of the community so that children are socialized and also just improving their psychosocial well-being. In that approach, we reach quite a reasonable number of children in that program. The other thing before sharing the mic to my colleagues, one of the flagship program that we have is the Learning Through Play. Is supported by the Lego Foundation, which is also just really just situated in terms of really just bringing a new modality to really just managing the teaching learning process. More of a kind of well-designed, interactive teaching learning process, and that project is implementing in the refugee camps and surrounding host communities. So the learning through play is a kind of an intentional planning, particularly looking from the perspective of play. We try to really just contextualize with the culture, with with the norm that we have in the different parts of the country. But that learning activity is really just helping the interactive learning to the students. In terms of looking the number of reach, so far we able to just reach more than 98,000 students through the learning through play, and that is really just contributing a lot in terms of looking the learning outcomes as well. So in terms of looking the field level examination, particularly looking the different non-formal and informal education activities that we did, we also just achieved this 80% of the transition rates, particularly looking those students start passing the placement exam from grade to grade, or those formal education is also just linked with their age. In terms of looking the contribution of the learning through play, we also just conduct these baselines and in the line in terms of really just putting a controlling environment. So there is also just a significant improvement in student engagement with the help of learning through play. The classroom management is quite improved, significantly improved from the average, and the teaching practice is completely changed. Not only the teaching practice on the ground, but in terms of also just looking to see how the learning through play is also just be part and parcel of the education policy, the education curriculums, and taking us as one of the tool for the pedagogy. In terms of looking the teacher well-being, there is also just significant improvement. One is looking from the perspective of their preparation of the lesson, but also just focusing on the peer collaboration is also just significantly improved. So these are some of the key outcomes that we also just identified from the different variety of education approach that we are also just put in place in the different setups that we have. Over to Joseph.
Yes. Thank you so much, Iwuti. So we move over to Joseph once he's ready.
Yes, thank you very much. And Hiwote, you did a very uh, good job introducing learning through play, which is partly what my presentation is about. I'll put this on presentation mode to proceed. Okay, well, so my name is Joseph Opondo. I work with Plan on specifically a program called Play Matters, which is a 6-year intervention rescue committee, Plan International, War Child Alliance, Innovation for Poverty Action, and Behavior Insights team in partnership, of course, with the Lego Foundation that is providing the resources. The project works, of course, in Ethiopia, and briefly, I think what they mentioned, the work that we do there. I will focus mostly on the other countries to share what has worked in advancing foundational learning in Tanzania and Uganda, where else the program is implemented to integrate learning through play into education systems, serving, of course, both refugee and host communities. There are 3 key components of this program. One is promoting play-based learning, which Hiwote just spoke about briefly, but through, of course, teacher professional development. And then the second key component is running parent and community support. Running parent and community support in running parent and community support in school activities and strengthening of course education systems. The program is generally designed to work with government structures, not as a parallel, but of course with government to advance play-based learning to develop the capacity of teachers to deliver through child-centered approaches to achieve that. Now, generally, I think this we know because I know all the people that could be listening in and this would be like pretty to the pop because you know that sustainability is a challenge, especially in fragile contexts. Education is already underfunded, but when funding, of course, collapses and donor funding ends, usually activities stop, systems fail, teacher motivation, of course, declines, community engagement. They tend to be disengaged from what has been established already. Yet the key challenge is not only in improving learning during crisis, but of course sustaining gains beyond project cycles. And I'm going to share some field-based evidence. Of course, partly what he has spoken about the RCT that was done in the Somali region. But in this evidence brief that I've also linked towards the end of my presentation, which anyone can reference when Johnson shares with you these presentations, you'll be able to see. There's also the evidence brief has a bit of that RCT, the randomized control trial, together with a cost-efficient study that was done in there. And I'll be sharing around what community has been supporting with, and of course, another evidence on how to sustain community engagement. So the RCT was spoken about, definitely where learning through play is applied. Teachers show gains in instructional practices, and there's improvement in foundational learning skills, numeracy, socio-emotional learning, but also moderate gains in literacy and, of course, well-being. But the other one that I want to highlight is the third bullet, which is evident on your screen right now. Compared to education interventions in conflict-affected settings, Play Matters in Ethiopia achieved 4 times the impact on children's socio-emotional learning outcomes, 2 times the impact on numeracy, and similar impacts on literacy of 1/6 of the average cost of education interventions in conflict settings. And that's about 38 US dollars per child compared to 240 US dollars, which is usually the average. There isn't much data in this field, but what we managed to gather was actually that. So what does this say? It says that learning through play can actually be integrated within national teacher professional development frameworks, and it can contribute towards strengthening foundational learning, its quality, equity, but also building resilience within the education space. The other, I want us to also reference another learning we've picked from the field around parent and community engagement, which has demonstrated that, whenever there's increased parental and community involvement in school affairs, teachers' classroom practices improves in terms of classroom management, positive discipline, student engagement, use of materials, and whenever there's positive feedback given to teachers by parents, it motivates them to adopt and continue using learning through play techniques. So generally, what this says is that community participation strengthens trust, shared responsibility, and continuity. even when there's disruption in learning. And there's a graph there from Uganda showing exactly what I've been speaking about on the other side. This is a framework that also we picked from the field, trying to establish how we sustain community engagement to communities to promote, to continue engaging in school activities to promote foundational learning. So, and there's a framework here that we've established over the years, 5 years of 6 years of implementing this project. Community engagement is sustained. Their involvement in education is sustained when low-cost relationship-based approaches like door-to-door mobilization, learner-led invitations, if those combine with low innovations like volunteerism and then we have the school management committee trained on their roles and responsibilities. Um, if that combines with a consistent and strong school leadership, and then parents are of course interested to learn and recognize the value of the intervention, the foundational learning intervention. Usually we saw that in the schools that we've been implementing, in those that uh, have this kind of model, surely do sustain community engagement for education. And where parents are involved, of course, you saw that it impacts on the teacher's performance, and the teacher's performance ends in there. One very hidden finding, it was unexpected, that came out was also that schools, beyond academic gains, it became a space for social cohesion, for communities play together, parents interacted, forgetting about their previous ethnic divisions. And you can see a voice there from Tanzania saying, we can no longer distinguish between displaced and host children. So friends, why does this matter for resilience and of course stability? It's because it builds human capital in terms of numeracy, literacy, and socio-emotional skills. Play-based learning, of course, fosters empathy, collaboration, and positive interaction, as mentioned earlier, between communities, but also within classrooms, but also where the communities actually own and the interventions are embedded within systems. Approaches strengthen continuity, resilience, and stability beyond donor circles. One last call really before I hand over. Of course, some insights to take on is, we need to design with sustainability from the onset. And these are things that we've been doing, but it's just good to reiterate them. Invest in relational low-cost strategies. It doesn't have to be very expensive. Integrate learning through play into national teacher development curricula and any other education intervention that is focused on foundational learning. Integration is key because I think it was Heather who mentioned that, integrate within systems from the onset. And if they already exist, then that sustainability becomes very easy. And then, of course, we need to provide flexible multi-year funding that supports system integration rather than short-term parallel, which I think Katie also mentioned in the RTIA intervention. That is multi-year, because many times we design pilot, but when it comes to scale, we have no money to scale, and we assume that governments are going to take on, or communities are going to take on, but they're not yet ready. They need to be handheld in the process. So my friends, in conclusion, foundational learning can be advanced in fragile contexts by embedding learning through play within community ownership and system structures. This matters. It equips children to thrive. They're able to thrive. Their literacy and numeracy skills and social-emotional skills are improved. And of course, it provides sustainability. In case you would want to reference some of these, I've linked them, the studies that I've been referencing, evidence from the field, they're right there. And you can also visit the Play Matters website at www.playmatters.org for all these resources that I've been referencing. I will give it back to you, Johnson, so you can lead us through the next session. Thank you very much for your time and for listening.
Thank you so much, Joseph. A big round of applause. I'm sure you agree this has been packed, tight, but exciting also. Just by a show of hands, who has questions? Because we want to ensure that we take all the questions in the room today. Okay, I see one hand. Do we have? Okay, okay. There's a question online. Okay, all right. So at this point, thank you so much. At this point, I'm going to invite Heather and Katie to please join me. So there's going to be one. Okay, another question. Okay, looking at my time. Okay. So there's going to be one round of questions to each of our panelists, and then we'll go to the room. Who do I start with? Heather. So we often say that education interventions should be evidence informed, but in fragile contexts, the realities are often complex, fast moving, and unpredictable. So how should practitioners think about what works when the context itself is unstable?
Thank you, and that's a really useful and pertinent question. I think the first thing I would say is that we actually have more evidence than we think. Um, there's a lot of evidence on what works and what we can do to intervene. There's a lot of examples of different really creative approaches that people have taken in order to reach communities that are affected, that maybe we don't exactly know if that worked in that context, but just the idea of it. Like, for example, there was funding in one of the studies in Zambia that went to giving bicycles to teachers during COVID so that they could reach not their school, but the community they lived in. They could reach children there and set up community learning groups there. They didn't measure learning outcomes, so I couldn't include them in the brief, but those kind of strategies, there's a lot out there that people write about that they do and that exists, that I would urge people to really look at. And particularly if we want to focus on foundational learning, we know what works to improve foundational learning. And the thing that we need to really work on, and the thing that we see coming out in the evidence, is that those established relationships matter. Crises will come or are already happening, but when those systems and structures are in place, it's much easier to deploy, it's much easier to leverage them when there's a crisis to continue to do what we already know works.
Thank you so much. A big round of applause to Heather. So, Katie, moving quickly, so from the perspective of international partnerships, especially looking at the EU engagement, what can donors and policy actors begin to do differently to support foundational learning in fragile contexts in a way that is both immediate and then sustainable?
It's a very good question. So first of all, we know that it's important to stay engaged where it's hardest in those most difficult of environments. So the needs are greatest in fragile and crisis affected contexts, but support can also be more volatile there. So on the EU side, we're addressing this by directing a significant share of our education funding to fragile and conflict affected contexts, and by also using that wider EU toolbox to keep foundational learning going and also to address those root causes of instability. Secondly, and it's probably not going to surprise you that I'm saying this, given that I spoke about the Regional Teachers Initiative for Africa, but we need to be focusing on teachers and the systems that are around those teachers. So that means moving to comprehensive country-owned teacher policies that cover recruitment, that cover deployment, initial and in-service training, working conditions and support to make sure that we are really getting that support to teachers. And then thirdly, I think we've talked a lot today about foundational learning, and I know that it's a panel on foundational learning, but these foundational skills very much set the framework for what comes afterwards, so for further learning and for the world of work afterwards, and with that comes the link to vocational education and training. And so we need to be supporting coherent pathways from basic education to vocational education and training, and making sure that we are aligning curricula, guidance, and also financing, so that those strong foundational skills translate into relevant technical skills, and decent jobs and opportunities, so that those young people that are most at risk have those opportunities and are able to advance once we go beyond foundational learning and beyond school.
Thank you so much, Katie. Same thing, a big round of applause to her. So I'm quickly moving on to Hiwoti and Joseph online. So either of you can take this question, please. Um, so Hiwoti, Joseph, so from your experience, I know you've shared quite a lot of context with us, but what are some of the most important conditions that allow education and foundational learning interventions to work in crisis-affected or fragile contexts? So this is either to Hiwoti or Joseph. Do we still have them online?
Are you hearing me?
Okay, yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Yeah. I think that is a very important question, particularly looking how we are going to just ensure the continuity of education service for the learner in a different crisis setup. I think from the practitioner perspective, the most important thing is how we are also just going to just ensure or improve the engagement of the community, particularly looking from the perspective of the foundational learning. It's also just starting from socialization, the psychosocial well-being and socio-emotional skill for the students. So that is expected to start from the home, from the community. So the community engagement play a very critical role on that. So rather than just looking for this a kind of this formal education curriculum, better like in terms of really just looking the context and how we are going to really just ensure the engagement of the community, particularly looking from the perspective of empowering the parent-teacher association and how they are also just going to support in terms of creating safe learning environment, but also just how the committee is going to be just a facilitator for the basic education. The other thing is integrating the social-emotional learning in the education curriculum. Yeah, in terms of really just looking how we are going to give bigger weights on their mental health and psychosocial support, particularly looking people displaced from their place of origin, be it in the internally displaced people, be it in the refuge. The environment and the situation is new, and that's also just creating the psychosocial problem. So I think embedding and integrating MHPSS in the curriculum is really just key and instrumental in terms of really just improving the learning outcome. The last point from my side is like in terms of really just looking how we're also just going to be more flexible, more adaptable, rather than just sticking with formal education curriculum like the age-based, the grade-based education system, but how we are also just going to just understand the situations and how we can develop a very flexible and very adaptable teaching learning practice in the different setup. So I think if we're really just doing that, definitely we can really just strengthen the foundational learnings in the crisis setup. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Iwotie. Very mindful of time. So I have just one more question to Joseph, and then we'll go to the room. So Joseph, if you can still hear me, so during the conference today, we've heard about how the lines or the boundaries between emergency response, recovery, and long-term development is increasingly blurred. So what needs to change in how humanitarian and development actors work together, especially if we want to protect learning and strengthen systems at the same time?
Thanks, Johnson. And I'll try to keep it brief in the interest of time. But too often, humanitarian interventions are designed for speed, and times they remain disconnected from systems, supervision, and of course, community accountability to design, knowing that in as much as education emergency responds to specific needs, it's supposed to be done in a speedy manner. We need to think about what about the long term. So trying to strike a balance, and rather than treat them as two separate things, try to think about integrating um, a speedy response along with long systems to continue doing that. So that should be other very key and very important is to start by investing more deliberately on local actors. And by this, I mean teachers at the school level, school age teachers, communities, but also local organizations, because they remain present long after external actors have left. Um, I know there's a temptation many times to think us who are, in the INGOs think that they may not have capacity, but building that capacity deliberately and making sure that we capacitate them to deliver when we are long gone is very, very pertinent. So those two, I think, are very, very important. So in conclusion, really, protecting learning and system strengthening should not be treated as competing priorities, but as complementary aspects Um, Thank you very much, and back to Johnson.
Thank you so much, Joseph. And on that note, we move to our in-person participants. I saw a show of hands earlier on, so Sharon, please, and I think you have a question too. Okay.
Thank you so much, Namola, and thank you to the panelists for a very interesting session. I have a question for Heather. So you spoke about how the two-way interaction is very important and the targeted learning is very important that teachers provide to students. And also you spoke about existing systems and using those. I was wondering, in your synthesis, did you find anything about what kind of support do the teachers need to make this switch, and also education systems more broadly? Was there anything that you found in your synthesis that you found across these different contexts?
Okay.
Thank
Can
you.
we also have the other question and then we can treat it together? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je voudrais intervenir en français si ça ne vous dérange pas.
Just speak French.
My English is not
So,
okay. Maybe I can try, but I'm not English speaking. I just want to better understand your intervention in Niger, because you said that the average is very low, and so what I want to know is with which NGO are you working there, and also what was their strategy for the implementation? Because I know that from 2007, no, 2005 to 2008, I was coordinator of one of program with Catholic Relief Services, Plan International, and World Vision, according the strengthening, according child labor. Sorry. And I know that our first strategy was to work hardly with communities, because if you don't have the confidence of communities, we can't bring their children to go to school in Niger. It's very hard. The child labor is very, very, very high. And also, as you know, the early marriage and everything that we're focusing. So we have to focus our intervention first with communities to set up a common strategy, and before we start. So I would like to understand, or to better understand, what did you use as strategy in order to help this project? Thank you very much.
so two questions.
Quite well English, don't worry.
Okay. Well, I think that your English was. All right. So we have 6 more minutes to wrap up this entire session. So we'll quickly go to your response.
Thank you. I'm going to start with the Niger question, if that's okay. Our work was just a synthesis of published research. So it's not that we were doing the intervention. The study I was talking about is called Tutoring in a Healing Classroom. And from what I understand, it did involve a lot of community engagement. There were cash transfers specifically to girls in order to attend school as an incentive for families to send girls to school. There was a number of different things that they intervened at once. I can share the paper and the report with you if that will be useful, but it's not research we're conducting ourselves, it's just research we were translating into evidence. Thank you. And then, yeah, Sharon, definitely on what you asked, the support for teachers, honestly, I really wish this was written about more. I was a teacher myself in South Africa, and whenever I read research, it's kind of like teachers are interchangeable with tutors or volunteers or facilitators, and it's not always clear, like that real, like what support the teachers need to get for this, or it's mentioned teacher training, like what teacher training, at what level, what was the training on. Those kind of things are really not written about in the level of detail in the reports of the research as the findings and the outcomes and all the kind of graphs and those kind of things. So I really wish that that was focused on more in reports of research, and would really implore for people to do that, because I think that's the learning that can really be translated across organizations. Like, what did you do that made change in teacher practice? What did you do that supported teachers to enable them to do this? Because a teacher just being told, well, change what you're doing or do this in a different way. You don't know my classroom, and I would have said that to you if you had told me to do that when I was a teacher too. um, but there was a study in Madagascar that did look at the only intervention they did was training for teachers during COVID, and also they implemented school action plans. So they got a parent teacher association going that could set up a school action plan specifically for each school. And the training that they did was on targeted instruction techniques specifically, and it was successful. And often we don't see learning outcomes change just from teacher training initiatives. That's not always a direct kind of improvement. And the teacher training plans plus school action plans did facilitate some kind of learning change in those schools. But there's really not enough written about that.
All right, thank you. Answers your question? Yes, one question, please. Okay, and then we would have the final question here.
Thank you very much. Just checking with my colleagues, especially from Ethiopia, we know that many of the refugees that cross either from Sudan or South Sudan are over the age of primary, or children going to primary. I've looked at the accelerated learning program, school-based program. Mainly the discussion is about primary. What about those who are already above primary going age? What is there anything that's being done for them? Because those are quite a problem. Thank you.
Thank you. And our final question.
Thanks very much to all the presenters. I'm Caroline Grant from the British Council. My question is around the investment in initial teacher education in foundational learning, because most of the interventions that we come across are focused at in-service teacher education. And as we all know, that's a bit, it's impossible really to address the problem at scale at in-service. And I'm just wondering whether we should be looking more at what's happening at pre-service so that we can actually prevent the problem at source. Thanks.
Yeah. Katie, do you want to take that? Am I putting you on the spot? Okay, before we do that, Hiwotie, if you're online, can you please take the first question? And then any of our panelists can respond to the second question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think that is
in 1 minute, please. Being mindful of time. In 1 minute.
Sure.
Thank you.
So I think in relation to this accelerated school readiness or ALP program is designated for the primary school age children, but in the upper primary and the secondary, except this life skill training that's also just provided for those older children in the age of adolescence. The only just intervention that's happening is the life skill, which is also just embedded with the secondary education. So I think those are some of the effort and the practice that we have, but it's not comprehensive as if other alternative education service for the lower primary school. So this is what I would like to share back to you.
Good. Do you want to
Yes.
attempt?
And on Caroline's question on the pre-service teacher training, so if you look at what we're doing under window 1 of the Regional Teachers Initiative for Africa, when we are providing technical assistance to ministries of education, we're also looking at pre-service teacher training. So that depends on the ministries of education come to the program, they define their needs, we work with them in order to define those, to come up with an action plan. I think I'm looking at the time, it's just gone to exactly to 3 o'clock, so we can share some more examples of that with you. But I think it's a really pertinent point, and going back to the point that the Plan International colleagues made, it's also a reason on the kind of multi-year, multi-level programs that we need to be looking at what works, but then also be able to make changes as necessary if we see that there are specific gaps in specific countries, sub-regions, or on a continental level, to be able to adapt as necessary.
So on a final note, since we're already at the end of this session and you have the mic, what's one final key takeaway that you want participants to leave with?
I think my key takeaway actually is from Heather's slide on that, yes, it's important to know what works, but also what doesn't work. And that was really refreshing. And I don't think it's something that we talk about enough, that we need to be making sure that, yes, we understand what works. And I guess that's in the clues in the name of the What Works Hub, but being honest and being able to define what doesn't work is equally important. So when we are looking at programs such as the Regional Teachers Initiative for Africa and other big regional programs, that we are able to be sure the direction of those that we want to go in the future and the direction that we don't want them to go in. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Katie. Eva?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And I think that is something really important to look at as well. And I wish people would, again, publish more of that because it's really useful to see what doesn't work and you can learn from it. Often it's a small tweak that would change that. But as a final takeaway, I think the thing I want to just really drive home is we know what can support, and what we need to understand more is how to support. We really do have knowledge. The gap is in implementing that knowledge, and that's, I think, where a lot of attention should be focused, not on trying a new RCT or a new experiment to see what's going to work. Like, actually, how does it work, and what can we understand from how it was implemented?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Heather. Let's move over to Hiwotie and then Joseph. Not in 60
I
seconds now,
think
maybe like in 30 seconds.
the last word from my side, particularly looking this foundational learning, is basically looking the flexibility and adaptability, not looking from the perspective of, like, in terms of contextualizing, but how as an education partner is also just providing education at the right level, not really just focusing on their age or their grading system, but how we can really just tailoring the education service at their at the right level is the most important thing. And this is one of the critical challenges that we have in a country, and this is something that as Plan International is also just taking forward to streamline the education service at the right level rather than just follow the blueprint curriculum that we have, because the crisis context is quite different from the normal education activities that we do. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Hiwotie. And finally, let's hear from Joseph.
Yes, thank you, Johnson. Teachers are at the heart of foundational learning. I think that is my key takeaway today. And that means that we need to invest in them, and not from only one-off trainings during emergencies, but have those trainings and continuous professional development happen within the school environment even long after. It's important that we integrate teacher professional development interventions within government systems, because when the emergency response is done, the children have to continue, and they can only continue learning through the teacher, who is of course already burdened with all interventions because of their centrality. You find there's RTIA on them, there's play matters on them demanding for so much. So the teacher is that important. They cannot replace them, but we need to handle them and know that they are the center of that and treat them as such as very important elements in promoting foundational learning. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joseph. A big round of applause to all our speakers. I think one thing is clear today, and that is that the focus should not just be on identifying challenges, but on understanding what works, for whom, under what conditions, and what it takes to sustain it. And on this note, we'll be wrapping up today's session. Thanks so much for joining me, and thank you so much to our participants. So just a reminder that all the presentations, all the slides for this session will be available on the website afterwards for you to be able to go through. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the session. Thank you so much. Thank you.